Namaskar. There are more than 130 different Mahabharata researchers who have used or claim to have used astronomy evidence from the Mahabharata text to arrive at those many different claims, the years for the Mahabharata war. And so ordinary person is extremely confused as to how come if everybody begins with the same set of evidence but still reach different conclusions. Well, the answer is they actually don't. And what we mean by that is actually they don't use all the astronomy evidence, but there are bigger problems. And we would like to discuss specifically two areas. The first one is the widespread ignorance of scientific methodology. And within that, we will discuss a specific issue of how these researchers select evidence and how they go about testing it and what are the problems related to their methodology. The second problem we would like to discuss is the overall wrong approach, and within this there are some sub areas that we would like to discuss. Again, majority fail to understand this need for getting it approximately right before trying to fine-tune a specific claim for the year of Mahabharata war. And part of that is not understanding the sequence of testing, relevance of each astronomy observation, and the bigger problem, which also gets into the first problem that we are referring to, is that majority of them, almost all of them, are testing only arbitrary or selective set of astronomy evidence. And naturally, this is leading to a disaster. We will quickly give you an illustration of a correct methodology and a right approach, and then we will summarize our presentation. So let's begin with the first problem, a widespread ignorance of scientific methodology. Now, there are many aspects to this. We are going to discuss specifically two aspects. One, that of evidence. Suppose we plot this evidence on the vertical axis with its two ends as all relevant evidence, which is logical and rational on one side, and only arbitrary or a selective set of evidence, which is illogical, irrational, non-scientific, unscientific on the other end. We can look at the second aspect of objective testing as our x-axis, going from the evidence is such, the theory is such that the evidence becomes objectively testable versus the evidence is not objectively testable. Now, plotting these two variables in this fashion allow us to look at all the research efforts, more than 130 plus, and classify them into these four quadrants. We have given them names. The first quadrant is preservation of tradition, the second quadrant is dharmic assertions, tamasic skepticism, and the fourth quadrant superficial and manipulative claims. Now, let's look at what is good about each of the quadrant and what is bad about each of them. So when it comes to the usage of all relevant evidence, so the evidence aspect of it, the preservation of tradition passes with qualifying marks. It's good because it's looking at all the relevant evidence. Dharmic assertions does the same, tamasic skepticism doesn't do that, and so is superficial and manipulative claims. Let's do the same thing for testability. Preservation of tradition is not interested in testability. Dharmic assertion is, tamasic skepticism is not, and superficial and manipulative claims is. So if you look at the check marks, we can easily say that dharmic assertion is the only quadrant that gets both check marks, that is scientifically a desired quadrant and it's a good stuff. If we look at tamasic skepticism, it fails on both counts, and therefore such approach is to be discarded. Preservation of tradition. What could be a good example? Think of Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute and their effort to create the critical edition of Mahabharata. They were not interested, they were not focused on testing the evidence to figure out when Mahabharata war would have occurred, but they were focused on finding a critical edition based on multiple manuscripts. And still, what is important to know is that anytime there was a deviation, they did not throw those references away, but they carefully documented those references. Okay, that's all relevant evidence. Everything was documented for the benefit of posterity. Now, coming to superficial and manipulative claims, this is superficial and also manipulative because it has that veneer of objective testability. It does test whatever little arbitrary or selective evidence they look at. But that is also a problem. And what is the problem? Because anyone can take a arbitrary or selective set of data and fit it for any claim, any timeline. But that is not scientific. Unfortunately, as you will see, if we look at all the efforts, all the multiple efforts, you'll find very few fall into this preservation of tradition, even fewer fall into these dharmic assertions, and a majority, 95, 96, 97% plus of them fall into this unfortunate quadrant of superficial and manipulative claims. Let's look at quickly the second problem, second issue that we would like to discuss, that is of a wrong approach. And again, to repeat, majority of the researchers simply do not understand that they have to get it approximately right first before they can get to a specific year. And what we mean by that, let me give you an example. Suppose we want to find out if this cricket ball meets the criteria set by Indian Cricket Board, for, let's say, playing men's cricket match. And we know the criteria. The criteria is given by the cricket board such that the diameter of this ball, and there are other criteria, but just this one is that the diameter has to be between these two numbers. So how do we figure it out? Well, there are many ways, but for example, we can take a vernier caliper like this, and what we have to do is take this cricket ball and we have to fit it nicely, snugly between these two prongs. And when we do that, what we will able to measure the diameter of the ball. How do we do it? Well, there is one main scale or the approximate scale, and along this line we can measure the approximate diameter of the ball. And to measure the precise, the decimal place accuracy, we have a secondary scale, also called a finer scale or a vernier scale. And what we have to do is look at this secondary scale and see which of these lines align well against these bar. And based on that, there are some calculations that we have to perform, which will tell us what the measurement of the diameter for this cricket ball is, that we can compare against these standards and come to a conclusion whether it fits the criteria or not. The bigger point I'm trying to make is this: if one cannot achieve approximately right, and what I mean by that is if one does not fit this cricket ball between these prongs properly, it doesn't matter if our reading is not approximately right along this main scale. It doesn't matter what we do with this finer vernier secondary scale, the answer will definitely be wrong. So getting approximately right is very critical. Again, to give you an example of that, illustration of that, and we'll combine that with a sequence of testing. And that's like saying which dimension you get it right first, and then what do you do? So for example here, if we plot the relevance of each astronomy observation in determining the timing of Mahabharata war on the y-axis, and it goes from high to low or low to high. And then we plot on the x-axis testability, okay, or that is same as falsifiability, same as simplicity. How simple is the description? Is there a confusion around the interpretation and so on? And also that's same as prior improbability. Again, we plot that as from low to high. What you will find is, if you look at all these astronomy observation, AV observation, for example, would score high on both of these counts. That simply tells us it is the important observation, followed by observations such as a set of Bhishma Nirvana observations, and we will see why this is so, followed by planetary observations, then positions and phases of the moon, then descriptions of the season, eclipses, and then comet near Pushta, and so on. So the sequence is also very critical. Now, we may not know what is the desired sequence when we start testing them, but once we do test them, we should be careful in what sequence we draw the inferences. Okay, the second aspect of this wrong approach is testing only arbitrary or selective set of data and how that leads to a disaster. Okay, and then ignoring the testing of decisive evidence is manipulative, and why it is so. So, to give you a background, Mahabharata text has more than 215 astronomy observations, and they can be split into these two categories. Now, think of this, go back to the vernier caliper and think of it as a main scale and also the vernier scale. There is some evidence that allows you to get to the region approximately right, and then and only then you can use other set of evidence to fine-tune your claim for the year of Mahabharata war. So all the evidence can be split into two categories here. That's what I have done. The first category, I call it effects due to the precession of equinoxes, and these observations in the blue, and I call them approximately right. The point is, one must use these observations, one must employ these observations if they want to get the region for the plausible year of Mahabharata war approximately right. Before they can use the other set of data, what I call effects due to the near Earth phenomenon, that may allow to fine-tune the final claim for the year of Mahabharata war. What you're going to find is majority, 99% plus of Mahabharata researchers have simply not shown any awareness of these observations in the blue, AV observation, or 23 plus Bhishma Nirvana observations. If they were aware of it, they have tried to explain it away, and in some cases, as we will see, they have not used the whole entire data set, but they have only used arbitrary or selective observations, and naturally that has led to disaster. All right, so you cannot ignore these observations in the blue, and you must begin with these observations. And if you don't do that, let us see what happens. Okay, for example, let's take this evidence of Bhishma Nirvana. There are more than 23 observations, but there are a good number of researchers who have only employed 2 out of these 23. Now, 2 of these researchers have presented just before us. For example, Professor Mohan Gupta. And what you find is, again, he focused only on 1 of the 23 plus observations. And you know what? It fails on both counts. For example, there are some researchers who claim that there is a Mahabharata mention of moon near Rohini. Okay, many consider it interpolated, but let's move on. So Mohan Gupta, Professor Mohan Gupta, for his date, he cannot show the nakshatra of the moon on the day of winter solstice to be that of Rohini, but rather it is Vishakha, and the number of days from the day Bhishma fell in the battle for his deadline, for his timeline, and the day of winter solstice leads to 71 days and not 58 days based on that one selective arbitrary reference. The second presenter that we had today was Srimati Saroj Bala. And now look, interestingly, that she actually can show moon in Rohini for her day, her claimed day of Bhishma Nirvan, and the total duration of 58 days. So it's like, wow, okay, check, check, actually good check marks. But here is the problem. What is the blunder of employing only 2 of these 23 observations of Bhishma Nirvan? Well, these are these 2 observations that I'm referring to: moon near Rohini on the day of winter solstice, and the duration of 58 days between the 10th day of the war when Bhishma fell down in the battle and the day of winter solstice. Well, the result is this: all of them, not only these 8 or some 10 plus people who at least even bothered to come up with a claim for the day of Bhishma Nirvan, but rest of the 130 plus Mahabharata researchers, or they reach a wrong conclusion for not only the day of Bhishma Nirvan, but also for the year of Mahabharata war. And why is that? Because if you look at all the 23 plus references specific to Bhishma Nirvan, it leads you to the conclusion, it demands Bhishma to be on the bed of arrows for more than 92 days and not 58 days. All right, we are going to move on fast. Quick illustration of how to use a correct scientific methodology and how to use the correct approach. Let's begin with a timeline. We begin with where we are today, 2017 CE, and let's use the AV observation, Arundhati Vasishtha observation. Now, I'm not going to show you the demonstration of how this was tested. I have given multiple lectures. They are on the YouTube. I have written multiple blogs. They are at my blog site. And of course, the description is there in my book. But let's quickly jump to the inference that can be stated with mathematical certainty that based on this one observation that falls into this longer phenomenon of the precession of equinoxes. So you cannot play around with this observation. It tells us that Mahabharata war did not happen even a day later than 4508 BCE or a day earlier than 11,091 BCE. So that leaves us with this time interval between these 2 dates as the possible timing for the year of Mahabharata war. So let's eliminate the other time intervals. Let's quickly go to another set of observations, again due to the longer phenomenon of the precession of equinoxes. And what this Bhishma Nirvana observation coupled with other additional observations, astronomy observation, tells us is that Mahabharata war did not happen even a day later than 3700 BCE or a day earlier than 7000 BCE. So let's eliminate the other areas, only leaving overlapping area. So that leaves us with this approximate time interval of 2500 years. Now, the question is, how do we get down to one specific year? Well, we may able to or we may not able to. But irrespective of that, we can definitely say that the Mahabharata war did not happen anytime after 4508 BCE or anytime before 7000 BCE. And that is with mathematical certainty. So anyone not agreeing with this conclusion has to defend their case with respect to these 2 sets of observations and explain how do they go about testing it and why did they not test these observations. Well, let's go to the secondary scale. So we have multiple planetary positions. I'm going to pull 6 observations out of those, 3 for Saturn, 3 for Jupiter. Now, why is that? Because they are the slowest or slower moving visible planets. Again, each of them have 3 specific descriptions in the Mahabharata text, and Mahabharata researchers cannot play interpretation game with this because Saturn takes 30 years to come into the same position again. Jupiter takes 12 years before they can get into that particular position again. So whatever a desired position at the time of Mahabharata war, based on these descriptions, they would occur again every 60 years. Why is that? 12 times 5 is 60, 30 times 2 is 60. So that's the common factor. And based on that, we can identify instances within this 2500 year time interval that match for those descriptions. Okay, so we would end up with 2500 divided by 60, so approximately 40 specific instances. So we narrowed it down to 40. How do we get next to the next stage? Narrow it down further. Well, we can look at another set of data. For example, there are 6 specific descriptions of planet Mars in the Mahabharata text, and lo and behold, when we try testing these for each of these 40 instances, it leads us to one unique instance, and that happens to be in the year 5561 BCE. So that's our tentative claim for the year of Mahabharata war. Now, do we stop here? Of course not. Because all that we did so far is we used around 30 plus observations out of more than 215. So there are 180 plus additional astronomy observations, and we must test them to see if 5561 BCE still survives. And that's exactly what I did. Testing and corroboration of those additional 180 plus astronomy observations still validates the claim of 5561 BCE as the year of Mahabharata war. So quick summary: aim for approximately right first. Every observation falsifies any claim for the year of Mahabharata war that falls after 4500 BCE. Set of Bhishma Nirvana does the same for that any claim that falls after 3700 BCE, and if we combine them together, it gives us a time interval with mathematical certainty from 7000 BCE through 4508 BCE for the plausible year of Mahabharata war. Now, these above observations together falsify majority, almost all claims, existing claims for the year of Mahabharata war. No ifs, no buts. Any claim after 4508 BCE, gone. Then strive for precision and accuracy. Our claim, my claim is that 5561 BC is the year of Mahabharata war, but if someone can come up with a better claim within this 2500 period between 7000 and 4500 BCE, well, that's all power to them. And I request and encourage all Mahabharata researchers to come together and critique each other's claims in the spirit of and with the logic of scientific discovery. And I firmly believe, I'm convinced that there lies our progress, there lies our treasure. I wrote my first book, When Did the Mahabharata War Happen? In 2011. I wrote my second book using the same identical methodology on the Ramayana, the historic Ram, in 2014. Both of them are available in paperback, also in Kindle on Amazon. And I have written multiple, in hundreds of blog articles at my blog site, and there are many videos on YouTube, and that number is growing. With that, we will stop. Would love to take any questions or respond to any objections.